Good evening and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for this Bar Council seminar, Disability 1 in 8, Creating More Accessible and Inclusive Chambers. My name is Faisal Sadiq. I'm a barrister at Gatehouse Chambers, and I'm also chair of the Bar Council's Disability Panel, as well as one of the vice chairs of the Bar Council's Equality, Diversity and Social Mobility Committee. On the panel with me this evening is Fleur Donnelly-Jackson. Fleur is a lead business disability partner at the Business Disability Forum. We are very pleased at Bar Council. We joined the Business Disability Forum earlier this year, very much thanks to the efforts of Declan. And the Disability Forum provides us with a valuable resource that Bar Council is able to call upon in terms of supporting chambers and barristers, in particular on issues involving disability. Also on the panel is Mark Henderson. Mark is a barrister at Doughty Street. He's a specialist in media, public law and human rights. He was recognised as Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year in 2010, and he is also a member of the Disability Panel. And Mark and I have been having some very useful and hopefully in due course fruitful discussions with HMCTS and Judicial Office on reasonable adjustments and the Court of State. And last but not least is Declan O'Dempsey. Declan is a barrister at Cloisters. He's a specialist in complex employment discrimination, public and regulatory law, and a member of Bar Council's EDSM committee, as well as a member of the Disability Panel. By way of introduction, first of all, I would like to thank our partners for this evening. First of all, the Legal Practice Managers Association, and secondly, the Institute of Barristers Clerks. We are very grateful to them for their support in this important agenda item. There is also a live transcription that will be available throughout this webinar. It can be enabled by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. I must apologize in advance. It's not 100% accurate. If you really want to try, it's fascinating seeing how quite innocuous words can become quite rude words. So apologies in advance, but that facility is there. This session is being recorded and will be made available to attendees towards the end of the week. As attendees, your cameras and microphones, I'm afraid, are automatically switched off. Apologies for the errors in your joining instructions. Just to confirm, today only the members of the panel will be visible to you. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a box headed Q&A. If you have any questions, please insert them into the Q&A box, and when we get to the Q&A session, we will try and answer as many of them as is possible. I'll also add, we've been very lucky in having had a number of pre-submitted questions from attendees. As I said, I chair the Bar Council's Disability Panel. Really, our core function is providing support to barristers and chambers in terms of dealing with disability issues. Amongst the ways we do this, we have a Equality and Diversity helpline at Bar Council. And if a barrister or a member of chambers phones us with a query concerning disability, a request for reasonable adjustments, how exactly does a chambers deal with a particular issue? What adjustments can I expect my chambers to make? What's a good resource I can use to help us work through these sorts of issues? We have our helpline. We'd be delighted to get your calls and provide you with such assistance as we can. We also, on the Bar Council website, have a hub where we provide guidance on good practice in various areas, and it's a work in progress, so we're continually adding new guidance notes there. We also are at the forefront of Bar Council's campaigning activities in respect of accessibility in courts. About 24 months ago, the panel worked very hard on producing an accessibility audit for chambers, so chambers could identify areas where perhaps their premises or their practices were not in accordance with good practice. We're also working very hard to increase awareness of disability and normalizing practice with a disability, partly through role models. We have a blog where we ask role models to give a little insight into their practice and their lives, and partly through events like this. And we also are very keen to work to ensure that equality and disability issues are reflected in all aspects of Bar Council's work. So often, if Bar Council is consulted on a particular issue, we will seek to ensure that practitioners with disabilities and their interests, as well as those of their clients with disabilities, are taken into account. I'm afraid I'm a big one for statistics, and the statistics for the profession don't make heartening reading. And I'm hoping events like this and the activities of the disability panel can in time help address that. You may have seen the bar diversity stats that were published in January this year by the BSB. As respects questions on disability, the response rate was fairly low, so potentially questionable how useful the statistics are. We only had a response rate of 56.9%. Of that, however, the figures are particularly stark and disheartening. About 11.3% of the UK working age population have a disability. There are some commentators that suggest that is a low estimate, but even at the lower estimate of 11.6%, of those who declared their position as respects having or not having a disability, the numbers are pretty disappointing. Only 6.3% of those who disclosed their status disclosed they had a disability. So that's broadly 3.5% of the bar, significantly less than the 11.3% of the UK working age population. Of pupils, only 5.3% declared a disability, so 3.1% of pupils in the aggregate have identified as having a disability. Only 3.6% of non-silks who replied identified themselves as having a disability, which translates to only 3.7% of the bar in total. And alarmingly, only 3.4% of silks, which translates to about 1.6% of silks as a whole, identified themselves as having a disability. So what the statistics are telling us is that in terms of progression, there seems to be a decrease in the proportion of practitioners with disability as seniority rises. And that not only is that disappointing for practitioners with disabilities, it also suggests that there may be a variety of factors at play that mean that having courageously come to practice at the bar and committed themselves to this profession, institutional factors, access to courts, the economics of the bar are particularly hard on practitioners with disabilities. And we are hoping at Bar Council with partner organisations to work harder to try and address these rather stark figures. After my co-panelists have introduced themselves and spoken a little about their own experiences, we will have time for questions and answers. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Fleur.
Thank you so much. I think I'm the only one who's actually going to share some slides, so bear with me while I just put those up. So hopefully you can see some blue and white striped slides there. I'm going to talk a bit about the support that Business Disability Forum can provide to Bar Council through its membership. So you might be wondering who Business Disability Forum are. You might not have come across us before. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we really strongly believe that the 26 million people in the UK and over 1 billion people worldwide with disabilities and long-term health conditions enhance the social and economic health of our societies. And what we try to do is to support organisations by removing barriers, whether it's in business structures or in government, and those barriers are what really prevent disabled people from thriving and contributing. We've been around for about 30 years. We've got over 400 members, which includes global businesses right the way through to small and medium businesses too. And we also work with a number of government departments. So what is it that we do? We're one of the only organisations that exist to equip and work with every area and level of a business around its disability inclusion. And our experts have worked in a range of sectors with many different professions. So we've got tools and resources that go across a number of different areas, from how we support leaders and what's their commitment to disability inclusion, to recruitment and what are the adjustments you might need to make to recruitment processes, learning and development, talent, inclusion, human resources, how you engage your employees or the people that you work with, organisational development, health and safety, estates and facilities, comms, you name it. There's an area that we've got resources on that we can support with. So we provide support whether you're communicating your business's vision, driving strategy, writing policies, implementing procedures, designing processes, or managing people. And crucially, and I think it's always really quite important, 65% of our own staff and 60% of our leadership team have a disability or long-term condition. So we do also bring our own lived experience to the advice that we provide, and many of our staff are also further involved in other disabled people's organisations representing our own conditions or interests. So how do we go about supporting, and what is it that Bar Council has access to? So there are a range of different features that make up our offer. We have an advice service, so that would be available to Bar Council staff to contact us. If, for example, there was a tricky question about reasonable adjustments, that's quite a common one that comes into our advice service. They can provide information and best practice to support with that query. We also do policy reviews, and we have quite an amazing, if I say so myself, knowledge hub, which has got very many toolkits and different resources about all aspects of disability inclusion and across different business areas. We provide learning and development, so we do go out to organisations and help them to deliver and to put together bespoke training around disability and inclusion. Organisations that join as a member, like Bar Council, get a business partner. So I think Keith might be here today. He's the business partner for Bar Council. And we also do consultancy. That might be on things like workplace adjustments, recruitment reviews. And we have a tool which is called a disability smart audit as well. We also do lots of events and webinars, and we have conferences and things like tomorrow we're actually doing a showcase of our Disability Smart Awards. So there's a whole range of things which make up the offer and that Bar Council will have access through joining. So just to flag up some of those key toolkits that might be helpful, we have a getting started toolkit that helps organisations to work out what they're doing well, where they can improve, what sorts of actions they need to take to get started on becoming a disability smart business. We have a neurodiversity toolkit. This contains lots of resources and blogs and case studies and videos to help and shape an organisation's approach to neurodiversity. And equally, we have another one on mental health, which is does similar, but for mental health. We also have an occupational health mini toolkit. So that sets out some of the essentials for knowledge around occupational health, how to use it in terms of disability inclusion, whether it's issues around procurement or health and safety or adjustments or legal duties. So those are not all of the toolkits we have. There are many more, but those are some of the ones that I thought it might be helpful to mention. So we take a whole organisational approach. I think that's what's perhaps different about Business Disability Forum. We have resources which speak to each of these 10 different areas, whether it's your leadership, your learning and development, workplace adjustments or recruitment, your comms, your built environment and technology. So whenever there's a question that comes up around this, the suggestion I think is that if there is something that the way you would access BDF's resources would be through the EDI team at Bar Council. So you'd go back to them and they would be able to use the resources which we have. But I'm going to talk also a little bit about how you might access some of these things directly too. I think a further point that's really quite important to showcase how you are disability committed or disability confident as an employer or as a leader is something that we can support you with. We help support our members to progress through these different levels from 1 to 3, and we carry out disability confident level 3 validations, which is where you submit evidence to show that you've actually met the criteria of disability confident, and we do that through our advice service. So that's also a service that's available. It's important because nowadays many public sector organisations are also choosing to only give contracts to businesses on the basis that they are actually disability confident. So this is one of the further features of our membership offer. I thought I would just briefly touch on this because it might come up in some of the Q&A later. We have direct experience of access to work. So if a question came up about support from access to work, it's something that we can also support on. Access to work is a scheme that enables people who are in paid work or about to start work or have an interview for a job to get support so that they can have the adjustments put in place. Crucially, what it can do is actually fund those adjustments, and that takes the emphasis off a business actually trying to find the funding for that if it's not something they have in their budget, but it's generally speaking something that the individual has to apply for. I've put a link there and these slides will be shared, so that link is actually to the Bar Council ethics sheet that they have on access to work. So then coming back to how might you directly access some of the resources and the things that I talked about. If you are an SME, so it might be as a chambers that you do in fact employ less than 250 people, so that's the general definition of an SME, could be anything from a sole trader through to around 250 employees. If you are in London, you're in luck because we actually have funding from City Bridge Trust, and that means that you can actually access our London Smarter London SME advice service for free. That service can help provide expert advice on disability and how it relates to your organisation. We can help with things like guidance on adjustments, your responsibilities and inclusive business, delivering inclusive services to disabled customers, advice on policies, and advice on customer complaints and disputes. And so I've put there the email address if you want to follow up, if you're interested in that, and also the web link. If you are outside of London, there is an offer, but that one is paid for. So membership for small businesses outside of London is £750, but you would get access to the similar support as the Smarter London SME advice service. I've put some further links on. I'm not going to talk you through all of these. Those are just for information if you want to follow up if there's anything that you might find helpful afterwards when the slides are shared. So I'm going to pop out of slide sharing. That's just my section on who we are at Business Disability Forum and the sort of support that's now available to Bar Council through its membership.
Thank you for that, Fleur. Mark, I think you're next.
Thank you, Faisal. Yeah, I am going to cover the Disability Confidence Scheme, which is a government scheme, and to what extent we, as in Doughty Street Chambers, where we are currently going through the accreditation, have found it a useful mechanism for chambers to upskill on disability awareness and combating disability discrimination. I was called to the bar in 1995, and that was also the year in which I was first involved in Bar Council EDI work. I was a very junior member of the Equality Code Implementation Committee under then Mr. Justice Sedley, which was responsible for adding sexual orientation as a protected ground to the code, then obviously operated by the Bar Council. There was no BSB. This was at a time when the criminal law targeted gay and bisexual men. The House of Commons had just endorsed that by rejecting an equal age of consent. Legal protection against discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation was years off. Equal marriage was decades off. So the bar was ahead and we faced little direct hostility. But what we did face was a gap in understanding that this was discrimination, just like racism and sexism, that we were combating. And what we were not dealing with was just an aspiration that people should be kind. So, for example, when we suggested inclusive language, we were told that this was not necessary because this was about respecting the privacy of this minority. And in fact, they don't talk about this sort of thing in their chambers anyway, but they then admit under questioning that they did occasionally mention their wives. It's usually wives, but they hadn't drawn the link with sexual minorities. The figures that Faisal was quoting from the BSB are horrible on disability. On LGBT, they're actually not too bad now. So anyway, I then spent 23 years in practice as a non-disabled barrister before sustaining a complete spinal cord injury and skull fracture in an accident while on holiday in August 2018. So following discharge from hospital in 2019, I returned to the bar as a full-time wheelchair user with a hearing impairment. So with a new and actually very visible in terms of the wheelchair protected ground on disability. All the things I'd taken for granted as a non-disabled barrister were gone in a flash: the right to enter a court independently, the right to make submissions from an equivalent position to my opponent if I was lucky enough to get into the court, entry to chambers independently, moving around independently, getting out of my room in chambers without assistance, getting into an accessible toilet in chambers. And people were very kind and concerned, but I felt with my new protected ground of disability, rather like I had done in the mid-1990s when we were putting homophobia and sexual orientation on the radar. There seemed to be, I felt, at the bar and in the courts system, a lack of real recognition of disability discrimination as on a par with other protected grounds. So a failure to replace steps with a ramp was considered very embarrassing and unkind, but was not thought of as unlawful discrimination and in breach of professional obligations discrimination. Similarly, there was not enough recognition of disability discrimination in society, of tropes about disabled people held consciously or unconsciously that needed to be combated at the bar and in the justice system. My first court appearance before a master at the RCJ, actually acting for Jeremy Corbyn in the summer of 2019, was aborted when the RCJ's wheelchair lift was found to be broken, except it turned out that they'd known it was broken, but it was not advertised, and nobody had done anything about it. Nobody knew an alternate wheelchair accessible route. My solicitor eventually handled the hearing and it got into the legal press. That led to a dialogue with the RCJ and led ultimately to me joining the disability panel, where I am currently working with inspiring colleagues like Declan, Faisal and Sam. But as I say, it does feel like I've gone back in time to the mid-90s in some ways. Getting change within chambers ought to be faster than the court system. However, it doesn't always turn out that way. Many chambers that have given EDI a lot of thought recently will still not have thought much about disability discrimination. We have the physical constraints, obviously, in many buildings. We also have organizational constraints, the slow democratic decision-making process, and we have self-employed status for QCs, barristers, fixed-term tenants, and pupils, which acts as a actual barrier and to some extent, and a perceived barrier to a greater extent to implementing anti-discrimination measures and recognizing the duty that all barristers have to ensure that chambers make reasonable adjustments. So after perhaps a slow start at Doughty Street, in the last year, we've had a new impetus from committed staff and the formation of the Disability Committee, which I was nominated to chair, which has given us a real focus and means that we are led by disabled people and allies who have a commitment to inclusivity and combating discrimination. We decided at an early stage that we would embrace disability confidence. Firstly, a word about the scheme. There are 3 tiers. Tier 1, disability committed. That really doesn't require very much except, as it says on the tin, commitment. And it's basically a commitment to move towards tier 2. So we did that immediately to start the ball rolling and ensure that we kept on going. Tier 2 introduces a lot of new criteria, some of which all have to be satisfied, others of which are offered on a list for which you have to satisfy at least one. They range from things such as work placements for disabled students to guaranteed interviews for disabled people who meet the minimum criteria and the job specification, to processes to support workers who become disabled, through to some much bigger criteria about providing an inclusive atmosphere, etc. It was introduced in 2016 in its current form to a lot of criticism from disabled people's organizations and others. The criticisms basically that many of the criteria just reflect what organizations are under a legal duty to do anyway, that it is based on self-accreditation other than the top tier 3 leader, which requires external accreditation, and that the criteria, even for organizations that don't use the self-accreditation to cut corners, is undemanding and many of them highly subjective. However, partly because it is seen as so undemanding, it has gained a lot of traction in the public sector and NGOs and charities, quite a lot of commercial organizations. The low bar was justified as reducing the excuses for not having it, and that has worked. And while, yes, many of these criteria are effectively certifying that you don't break the law, the knowledge gap on disability discrimination, lack of profile, is such that every little helps in terms of educating towards achieving compliance with the law. And while many of the criteria are vague, subjective, arguably platitudes, there are some more concrete ones, a couple of binary ones. In particular, the guaranteed interview scheme is actually quite useful, both in its own right and for the message that it sends to potential candidates. It's relatively easy to implement, no real resource implications. Also, targeted advertising by media aimed at disabled people is valuable. And these are the sorts of things that chambers is sort of especially likely to be a place where they are cans that get kicked down the road towards some nth new implementation subcommittee aimed at drawing it into an overarching EDI policy when we do budgeting next year, having considered all relevant factors, and in no time 3 years have gone with no progress on disability discrimination. Instead, by having chambers commit to this basic government scheme that we should at least be a disability confident employer, then you can point out that these are the things that we need to put in place. So once we're at the stage that the decision is taken, you can cut through to, this is what we need to do. We've already decided to do it. This is how we put it into operation. We just need to make it work. And I found that quite valuable. Couple of key points. It's important that we treat it as applying to the whole workforce in chambers. So not just employees, though that's obviously very important, but barristers, pupils, fixed term, squatters, third, sixth, whatever. And that reflects our professional obligations under the BSB code, as well as our duties under the Equality Act. Also use it to promote the anticipatory duty to clients, because too often that is treated as falling on the individual barrister and assigned clerk to make reasonable adjustments for clients coming into chambers, and nobody takes a more general view as to the work that is needed to make chambers more accessible for people with particular disabilities. And as long as you think about how much we can do rather than how little we can get away with in order to self-certify, I think it works. On the other hand, we should avoid being too perfectionist, which we're currently trying to do, because actually certifying as a disability confident employer in itself sends a message that is important. And as long as you're doing it in a genuine way, not as a tick box exercise, then that has a real value to it. And disability confident employer is itself only a stage to becoming a disability confident leader with the external accreditation that involves. So yeah, I think it's a tool to leverage actual improvements for our workforce and for clients, and has helped us get the ball rolling. And I hope many more chambers will embrace it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Mark. Thank you very much for that. We'll now launch straight into our Q&A session. We've had a number of pre-submitted questions. I can see we have one that's been submitted while we've been speaking, but I'll take one of the pre-submitted questions first, and I'll open it up to the panel at large. The question is, how can we get the court to make timely, reasonable adjustments or even responses for disabled barristers who wish to have the hearings by CVP or heard remotely? Who would like to set the ball rolling on that? Brilliant, Declan, please.
Thanks, Faisal. I think what I'd like to do is talk about the point more generally before looking at the CVP point in particular. Technically, you've got processes that you can follow in the civil courts, for example. I think you could indicate if you're in the case early enough, or it's known you're going to be in the case early enough, you could indicate on the allocation questionnaire that adjustments may be needed, and that can be done for all participants. That's the theoretical position, and it should theoretically draw attention to the adjustment that's needed. And so if a CVP hearing was needed for whatever reason, that might be the point at which to make the request. In practice, well, Faisal and I and others were talking about this earlier, and Faisal said the thing I find helps most is to make a lot of noise. Yes, So I think what it does mean is that there needs to be correspondence, probably alongside allocation questionnaires. Problem is, of course, that courts are very busy. They don't look at the allocation questionnaire. If you have written to the judge who is going to be allocated to the case, then that may be your best bet of getting anybody to have a look at it, not necessarily the judge, but the admin staff may look at it at that point. And it's worthwhile remembering that there's a distinction between the judicial decisions that will be made around a case and the decisions that are going to be made by HMCTS around the case. And the modalities of how the hearing is going to be conducted has got two aspects to it. One is the judicial aspect. Are they prepared to make any order that's necessary to make this happen, the CVP hearing? And the other one is, are they going to get the equipment in place? Now, I mentioned that not because of difficulties in getting CVP hearings together, but this is a more general point about getting reasonable adjustments from the courts. It's always worth remembering who you're targeting with your request. And if the request is going to be about the physical layout, for example, or the supply of interpreters, then you may well be in a negotiation or sometimes a case with HMCTS and not necessarily the judge. So you need to have a think about who you're talking to and make sure either that you make your request to the right person or you make your request in the alternative to both. So I think that would be the general advice on that. As to timely reasonable adjustments, right often, right early would be the advice.
Can I just jump in?
Sorry, please, yes. Sorry. No, absolutely. Please, Claire, do jump in.
So I can't answer the question in terms of practicalities immediately, what you can do, but I just think it's interesting that HMCTS, the court, will be bound by the public sector equality duty, of course. And so that duty to have more of that kind of anticipatory approach to removing barriers is something they should be looking to do. They should be looking to do access audits of their courts to try and remove barriers. I think what would be interesting is, so over the summer, I happened to be at Leeds Crown Court, and I saw there was the fast track use of the app to go in ahead in the queue if you were a barrister or from the legal professions. And I wonder if there's, in the future, potentially some kind of tech solution to this, where something could be there on the app, it's actually routed through to the court and they get that information, it's picked up on their side. So slightly different to the judicial route, but I do think there's certainly room for improvement.
Can I pick up on that as well, if that's all right? Fleur's absolutely right. And if you are in any kind of organisation, formal or informal, who has dealings with a court or series of courts in your region, then writing to them to say, what have you done for me lately under the public sector equality duty, is actually quite a good way of getting some of the more general issues that you might want sorted out at the court premises or court practices looked at. Public sector equality duty is always a tricky thing because it has quite a huge amount of wiggle room for the recipient of the request. But if what you're wanting to do is to get the issue up the agenda of the decision makers, then putting in a request making reference to that legal duty should theoretically, and often in practice does, allow allies within the system to bring the point to the attention of the decision makers. So I think it's a really good strategy. And on the whole, it probably works better for groups or organizations making that kind of request because that has a bit more clout. But individuals can do it as well. Thanks.
Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I mentioned that my work on disability started with lobbying the RCJ for access. That seemed like it was going well. We had a lot of warm words of the sort that Faisal described, and we were in discussions with them about how courts 37 and 38, which were the designated wheelchair accessible courts, could be made accessible. We then found out only when we were told they were unavailable for a hearing I was doing, that they'd been handed over as criminal courts. And we asked what impact assessment had been done on this, and we were eventually told that, well, it had been assessed that that would be good for criminal court users. So one thinks one is making progress, and then one finds that it was more apparent than real. The RCJ is particularly bad. The listing staff will commonly would tell clerks that a court is accessible when you can get into the public gallery. I've been put on a fold-away table in a corridor in the and told to make submissions from there, while my opponent, who declines to sit, is able to jump up and down as one would as a non-disabled barrister. The real issue is, as Declan touched on, getting through to someone who understands the problem and will take responsibility in advance. In that case, the judge was sympathetic, but he didn't know until the morning of the hearing. Some listing clerks and clerks treat it as a sort of request for a dispensation, like, could I be listed first because I've got a conference in the afternoon, rather than putting them on notice so that they can comply with the law. There is also a more general problem, possibly cultural problem, in terms of how the RCJ treats court users. We have highlighted a standard listing letter issued by the RCJ, which has a bullet point, wheelchairs, and states, if you use a wheelchair and have your own, please bring this with you. You'll need a carer or helper to support you when using a wheelchair, and our staff aren't trained or insured to do this. So there's a lot of work still to do in the RCJ, but we hope to make progress now through the disability panel, and we've got another meeting in January.
Great. Could I just add to that, at the risk of repeating what Declan's already said? What is very clear from discussions I've had both formally and informally with HMCTS is that often the problem isn't a lack of will, but a lack of resources. And they are horribly understaffed behind the scenes. It's often anything that needs to be done at very short notice when you don't have enough staff becomes a problem. I also work on the basis that simply, and have discovered, much to my cost, that simply because you've raised it with a judge and simply because something is even embodied in an order, that it does not mean that a member of court staff will necessarily pick up on it and then implement. And so my rule of thumb, and practice managers at Chambers know this is my rule of thumb also for filing skeleton arguments, so possibly it's just my rule of thumb generally, is I make as much noise as early on as is possible, and I write to anyone and everyone that I think it might be relevant to write to. So I have my clerks, practice managers, sorry, they will not like my saying clerks, phone the court, phone listing. I also ask for an email to be sent if necessary. If I know that a case is going to be heard by His Honour Judge Blob, I will email His Honour Judge Blob with suitable apologies, just saying, you'll recall I mentioned X at the CCMC. I've contacted the court. I just wanted to make sure Your Honour is aware of it. I also will, if I can find any other relevant email addresses, Chancery Guide, for example, is still helpful. For the work I do, it'll often list the identities of various court staff and give their email addresses. I will letterbomb them. I do that for a few reasons. One, while I'm a bit of a fan of out of office, the terror I have and what I've experienced is if someone is unexpectedly away, for example, they may not have switched on their out of office. It's entirely possible that your email is sitting unread. Secondly, where things have gone wrong, and I can say rather indignantly to my judge, I emailed blah, I emailed B, C, D, I phoned. The court service have obligations toward disabled court users. What more did you expect me to do? I have done everything I can possibly do. I think it really does make it an easier ask. In terms of the question was focused specifically on remote hearing CVP. I've tended to find two things. The readiness of a court to adopt CVP or remote hearings will vary across jurisdictions. I've tended to find the work I do, again, predominantly Chancery property based, the courts are very ready to do this. The readiness to adopt CVP remote hearings in the criminal courts, I think, is pretty dire. And what I've tended to find is, and we had this last year during the pandemic, and I think it possibly answers one of the questions that has been posed. Judges, court staff don't like to look like the baddie. So if you can make a compelling business case for why you need CVP and they look like the baddie if they don't give it to you, they will try to give you what you're seeking. What we found last year was often, and Amanda Pinto during her chairmanship of the bar was fantastic. We had a couple of cases where practitioners with disabilities would ask for CVP on the basis they were shielding, but they didn't actually want to tell the court why they needed CVP beyond, I have a disability, I need CVP. I work on the basis that I trust members of the bar if they say they need CVP for a disability, that they're going to be straightforward. We often ended up in a standoff where counsel was operating the basis I shouldn't have to reveal any more, and the court saying, actually, I need more information. My view is that reasonable adjustment, you need to be able to demonstrate you need it, and giving you the dispensation, giving you CVP is a reasonable thing. So I tend to operate on the basis that writing to the court in confidence, explaining why you need CVP, setting out the more rather than less detail, makes it a much easier ask. If you don't get it, my view is that there are issues as to the lawfulness of a refusal. Then do get in touch with bar counsel, but also, I mean, amongst the issues that can be raised is a letter to the court manager, a letter to the designated civil judge or the resident judge, possibly even raised with the circuit leader. I know the circuit leaders have done some very good work in raising informally along the lines of, this is just madness. Really? Is this seriously the ditch you want to die in? And suddenly you find judges having a bit of a volte-face. Anyway, I hope that's helped in terms of remote hearings. And I think that probably deals with one of the questions posed in the Q&A section. Fine, we've had a question, and I know we've got our pre-selected, but actually we've had a question about disability champions within individual courts, which actually Mark and I can speak on because it's formed part of our discussions with HMCTS. rather than my hogging all the airtime, Mark, why don't I let you explain where we've gotten with this?
Where have we got? We've asked for it. It's incredibly important that there should be named disability contact at every court. I think, but Faisal will correct me, I think we've got agreement in principle that this should happen. But to what extent it's been put in place, for example, the RCJ has a contact for the disability contact, but we've yet to see that bring any real concrete improvements. There are also designated judges responsible for EDI, largely for increasing diversity in judiciary, but at each court centre, who it may also be worth trying to engage in this. Faisal may have a more upbeat assessment.
I'm not for upbeat. We've raised it. It struck us this is a relatively easy ask from HMCTS. They do not have it. It does not exist. I am, and possibly this, I'm hoping it's not controversial, I'm not overly keen on a named individual being, with a particular email address being your contact point. Because again, what strikes me is often what happens is someone moves, they're no longer responsible, and we're all contacting a dead email address. The conversation we've had with HMCTS, I discovered a new word about a month ago, the exploding email, where you email address A, but the email gets cascaded to a number of members of staff. I think that one, it is useful to have an individual in each court building who is tasked with thinking about these things. But in terms of a contact point, I wouldn't want it to simply be restricted to that one individual. I think, having been a former civil servant, the yes we got, Mark, I took as a yes, that's interesting, rather than a yes, it's definitely going to happen. But where I think there was an appreciation that this is something that should be happening, resources permitting. And we're going to be taking this up with them again when we speak to them in January.
Can I just, oh, sorry, Declan's got his hand up first.
No, after you, Flo.
I was just going to say there might be something to learn from other sectors here. So if you go to some of the bigger theatres, you will find that they've got an email address which is access at whatever that theatre is. And that does exactly that. It might not just be one individual, it might be a group of people behind the scenes that support on that, but you can email in ahead of time what your access request is. And I just think that's seems like a very logical, sensible way to proceed.
We thought so, but I mean, there were very clearly resource issues for HMCTS, as with so many things. Sorry, Declan, I'm sorry.
That's right. I was going to perhaps add a slightly different perspective as well, in so far as one of the great problems about equality and diversity over the years since the Equality Act has come into effect is the problem of mainstreaming. And the great thing about a disability champion is that they can help to avoid mainstreaming or no streaming, as it might be thought of, i.e. it's everybody's responsibility, therefore it becomes nobody's responsibility. So I am rather more keen on the idea of a disability champion for that reason, specifically in relation to disability, because of the issues that make disability a very different category of discrimination, and the whole thing about thinking about reasonable adjustments and having a pool of knowledge in one place, well-informed disability champions can make a real difference. And I think that's a separate issue from the disappearing email address for adjustments needing to be made. As to the chances of persuading the courts to appoint one, well, Fleur's already mentioned public sector equality duty. Under that, there's a duty to have, due regard to the needs of a group which are different from the needs of other groups, and specifically that applies very much to the characteristic of disability. So I think there's a really quite strong argument to be made that this is an absolutely minimal thing that the courts could do, and indeed is not, in fact, all that resource thirsty for them, precisely because most reasonable adjustments are not that expensive to do, and they're more about thinking about how your procedures and your policies, rather than the things that people usually think about, which are related to physical changes to structures. Thank you.
Right, so looking at our pre-selected, oh, by the way, thank you, Fleur. I noticed there was a question. I couldn't see it, saw you had answered it, which is why it had disappeared. So thank you very much for that. So looking at our pre-selected questions, or pre-selected, the pre-submitted, sorry. We've had a question: how can barristers with a disability become more represented? Who'd like to take that? Please.
I think this is a tricky one to answer, but I will give it a go, because more represented in terms of there being more barristers with a disability within the profession. I'm going to take it in that sense. There's a whole range of things that need to be done. One of the things that I'm quite excited, dare I say it, about the fact that we now have the ability to access some detailed technical knowledge about reasonable adjustments. One of the issues around this is the whole thing about ignorance of how you do reasonable adjustments and the thought processes that go into reasonable adjustments. So I think that there's an issue around getting people to get that knowledge in the first place. That's one thing, and that's a profession-wide issue. Another area that I think we could probably do more about is early years education, if I can put it that way, because merely having access to concepts like reasonable adjustments and actually understanding them is not what changes mindsets. What changes mindsets very often is retirement. And I think there was one philosophy of science expert who said once that old scientists don't change their minds, they die. That's perhaps too pessimistic about the way in which culture change happens. And of course, it's more fluid than that. But early education and acculturation of the generations of people who are becoming barristers is a strategy that will, in the long term, bear fruit. And it'll bear fruit by making the commitment that the profession has as a whole to not just accommodation, but seeing one of the other questions that have been sent through, valuing the skills of barristers. That can come from a kind of upward pressure of what is and is not acceptable behaviour and the changing standards of acceptable behaviour. So I think that's a really important point. Two other points to make. One is the pressure that can come from your favourite Bar Council Equality and Diversity Committee. That can actually make a difference. We're always going on about equality issues and disability issues amongst them. And the other one is the involvement of the Bar Standards Board. I was the vice chair of the Bar Standards Board Equality and Diversity Committee for a while. And of course, they act as the regulators. And one of the other questions we've had in is, what can BSB do to ensure all chambers reach a minimum level of accessibility? Well, the answer is regulate, and regulate to ensure minimal legal standards are maintained at the very least. Now, when you look at their regulatory standards, they are relatively loose, I will say, but at its core, remember, they are a public sector duty bearer, so they need to be exercising their regulatory powers with a view to increasing equality of opportunity. And so they have that duty, and they also have the duty to inspect and make sure chambers are conforming to the minimum standards of accessibility. A topic I know on which we could be having a very extended conversation, because this really does bring out some of the difficulties and truly difficult issues around reasonable adjustments, even physical ones.
Mark, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, I agree with everything that Declan has said, and in particular that the panel's work is important, but also we need much more sort of grassroots communication with disabled barristers, because we need to demonstrate real case studies, the actual barriers people are facing. So there's a lot of work at the moment to create better networks of disabled barristers, and I think that's important, both in terms of representation and showing that support is out there. Given our experience at Doughty Street, I think that every chamber is having either a disability committee or at least a disability sort of officer is really important. It's not enough to have a general EDI committee or EDI officer, because the requirements of combating disability discrimination are specific, and they get lost in a general sort of EDI committee or campaign. And I mentioned regulatory duties in my talk earlier. Again, I couldn't agree with Declan more that the way that we improve things is to encourage the BSB to regulate, so that, for example, chambers must have thought in advance about how it will give a fair pupillage to a pupil who is selected, who turns out to be disabled, for example, a wheelchair user. I recall a discussion on Twitter. I returned to the bar as a disabled person, full-time wheelchair user when I was 24 years old. I am in awe of the people who are coming to the bar and dealing with these challenges as a pupil and new tenant. The discussion was that someone was talking about the advice they should have. It's going to be very difficult for a wheelchair user, and they should go off to a solicitor's firm first and then maybe think about the bar later. And a number of very senior practitioners piled in saying it was disgusting that that advice was given, and wheelchair users must come to the bar like everybody else. And that's great, but it also needs the same impetus amongst these very senior professionals to push the Bar Council and the BSB to create the structure and atmosphere where that can happen without unreasonable sacrifice.
Thanks, Mark. Sorry, Fleur, you had something to contribute.
Well, it's just to say that 90% of disabilities are non-visible. So it's highly likely that there are many more disabled barristers than you are aware of. They might already be there in your chambers. They just might not have felt safe to talk about that fact. So I will echo Declan and Mark. There are 2 points. There's the structural approach, which is how do you remove barriers? What adjustments can you put in place? So making sure your processes and policies, the resourcing, all of those questions are taken care of. But then the second part is, how do you get to a point of that positive culture change? You need to open up space for dialogue. You need to give people talking points. Quite often, you might find that people are afraid of talking about disability. They're worried about saying the wrong thing, getting the language wrong. So you've got to kind of make this safe space where people can talk about disability really openly. And some of the things you can do around that are indeed sharing stories, case studies, having champions, awareness raising events, all of that kind of positive side. So you need the both. It's a little bit carrot and stick, I think. You've got to look at both sides of the equation here. But if you can't make people feel really safe to talk about disability because they think there'll be some adverse impact to their career, then the battle's lost already. So I think doing events like this is also a really good approach.
I'm going to add my tuppence worth and use that hopefully to not inelegantly segue into a further question, which is what can we do as allies for disabled barristers? I suppose just parking that question for a second, I would echo what all of you have said. I have a disability that is not immediately obvious. So I have a condition called ankylosing spondylitis. It means, I mean, at the moment, lockdown has not been my friend. Mobility has not been fun. When pre-lockdown, it'd be very difficult to tell that I have a disability. I was in my last chambers with a very dear friend of mine who had ADHD, and again, not a visible disability. Another friend of mine in those chambers who is dyslexic, again, not a visible disability. And once I decided to bite the bullet and be much more open, for a long time I was very worried, what will happen to my career if people know of my condition? It does occasionally mean my clerks know that ideally I don't want to have to schlep heavy things to court. I like to have trial bundles scanned. Even before pandemic, I was a big fan of electronic working. I will like to be able to schedule my travel. I like to be able to make sure that if I can get cheap first class seats, or I guarantee to get a seat rather than stand, that I, in as far as is possible, am not having to schlep from one court to another back to back, so I can have a bit of recovery time. Now, I used to not mention these sorts of things. I used to not have those sorts of discussions. And about 10 years ago, I realized I was being a bit of a cowardly custard. Once I bit the bullet, it was incredible to me how many people came out of the woodwork and said they had disabilities, they needed support, and also how many people in chambers wanted to be helpful, proactive allies. And often, forgive me putting them this way, there was a very charming member of, not my last chambers, but chambers before that, who actually, in his attempt to show solidarity and to try and work through with me, how can I help, actually used the word cripple, which was, disastrous. For a moment, I could feel my cheeks flush, but I concentrated on actually what was the takeaway here. This is someone who was genuinely trying to be helpful and just didn't have the language. And very soon, through discussion, we were able to get to a point where there was a much more open dialogue in that chamber and my previous chambers as well about disability, that meant that people who wanted to be good allies were able to do so. And it actually benefited me. My asks didn't seem quite as unusual once it became clear that there were lots of people that needed help. I didn't seem quite the unique, curious creature that I was. Having said that, what do the rest of you think in terms of what allies can do for disabled practitioners to be good allies? Yes, Declan.
One thought that has occurred to me arising out of that and the other contributions we've just had is the thought about role modeling, and in particular, not just amongst invisible disabilities, but in particular those mental health conditions which many barristers would really worry about letting people know about: depression, anxiety in some cases, those things which I guess the worry is always going to be, well, people are going to think this affects my mental acuity and how good I'm going to be at the job. And in terms of role models, one thing that I think we could be looking at is trying to encourage people who have patent success, so QCs in particular, who are prepared to basically come out as having had mental health conditions. It's a really tricky process. It's a very personal decision for people to have to make. But I think over time, as cultural values change in relation to openness about mental health issues in society as a whole, then I think we will see leaders at the bar becoming role models for people who would otherwise worry about talking about those situations. I think Fleur is absolutely right. And it's a point that has troubled me for years and years and years. How do we do something about this? Is how do we start that dialogue going to get people to a position where they feel comfortable enough to talk about these matters? And I see that there's a question about autism and Asperger's, also how that's looked upon by the legal profession. That's a very broad question, because I think there are a number of different attitudes towards it. Not all of them would be wholly negative stereotypes. But that, I guess, opens up yet another category of invisible disability, and it illustrates how specific all our thoughts need to be about about disability and indeed role models. But anyway, over to you.
Yeah, at Dougherty Street, we are starting our disability awareness training tomorrow, and we've got a fairly comprehensive program with Disability Rights UK, so organised by a disabled people's organisation, which is great, which we are encouraging everyone in chambers to do, but requiring everyone to do who's involved in recruitment, management, leadership. So that's something that allies can do, and something that we hope will make more people into allies. We've also set up a disability network, which is a place where disabled barristers with visible and invisible or semi-visible disabilities can network safely without taking on any of the obligations or the visibility of the disability committee. And I also, like Faisal, have had a lot of people approach me who I wasn't aware were disabled, including quite a lot of people with a hearing impairment, sharing their bad experiences of loops, trying to get judges to speak up, etc. And I get on Declan's last point. There is an organization that's just been set up called BLEMI, I think it's probably called, which stands for the Barristers with Lived Experience of Mental Illness. I think they've got a Twitter handle, so I think you can probably Google it, and that which ought to be a really good resource as well.
So just to add my Tuppensworth on this one. Training is great. I think Disability Rights UK are an amazing organisation, so glad to hear you're doing training with them. Reverse mentoring is something that some organisations do, although sometimes the degree of caution around that you might be leaning on somebody's lived experience to inform somebody who doesn't have a disability. So it's really important if you set up those sorts of schemes to make sure that people are really supported. And just to recommend, there's an organisation called Purple Space, and they have lots of resources about allyship. They're another one of those organisations that are membership based, but I think some of their resources are free as well. And they're probably the organisation you see behind Purple Light Up. So for International Day of Persons with Disabilities, you might see buildings being lit up purple. It tends to be the really big buildings, stadiums, corporate HQs and so on. So there's different levels of allyship, everything from start to have the conversation, be the person that volunteers to open the conversation and to find out how people would like to talk about disability, through to really big things that you can do, which is, you know, on awareness raising dates and training programs. So I think there's a range of ways to be a really good ally.
Brilliant. What I'm going to do is, first of all, one question. I don't know how to undo when I've said answer live, so I'm going to have to answer it live. Yes, this is being recorded, and I understand it will be available toward the end of the week, so I can make that go away. So what I was going to propose we do next is, there are two questions, not precisely the same, but I thought we will probably cover related issues. So first of all, although I know Declan's already touched on it very briefly, how is autism and Asperger's looked upon by the legal profession? But also in advance of today, we had a question. Neurodiverse, in fact, sorry, let me just, I can't read my notes, apologies. Effectively, those who are neurodiverse have all sorts of challenges on their journey to the bar, and with a lower score in traditional academics, which is the result of the neurodivergence. Will Chambers make allowances for those? So I wondered if we could relate it. I'm conscious that we've only got 14 minutes left, so hopefully we could deal with both of those. I know in our pre-meeting discussion, Fleur, you wanted to have a first crack at this question. So over to you.
That's in part because I'm somebody who in my mid-40s is just about to go through that process of having a diagnostic assessment. So I cannot say with 100% certainty that I'm neurodiverse or have a particular condition, but it is something that I'm going through, and I'm also on the bar training course. So I think bring my lived experience to this. Yes, there are lots of challenges, I think, for neurodiverse students. I think those challenges will have been slightly different for students studying remotely as opposed to when they were in person. So for any of us on the bar course the last year, we'll have been doing lots of the training online, and that's thrown up interesting issues around the tech and about the platform underpinning the actual exam, so Inspera. So I think there are real challenges there. The bigger challenge, I think, is how is support offered to you, and perhaps some of the universities, training providers take a bit more of a medical approach, which is they want you to have that diagnosis. They want the bit of paper before they might put a learning agreement in place where some adjustments are then made. So it might be that you get extra time for examinations or allowances made in classes for the fact that you need extra time to process information. So yeah, I think it's interesting. Yes, there are stereotypes about neurodiverse people which are out there, and sometimes people have got real strengths. And so you might find chambers that think, oh goodness, if we get this person, they're going to have real attention to detail, real focus. They'll be able to absorb huge amounts of information. And that may be the case, but with neurodiversity, in fact, actually, each person, it can be quite different. It's very typical for neurodiverse people to have more than one condition overlapping. So you could have autism and ADHD, but then again, you might be dyspraxic and dyslexic. And so because of that combination, it's really important, I think, that when chambers are putting in place any adjustments for an individual, or indeed when universities are thinking about that, that it's very person-centered. They have the conversation with the individual to find out what support they might need. And I think relying on that medical approach too much when somebody might not know exactly what they need, you know, so they might not have the diagnosis, but they still face the same barriers, they're still facing the same challenges, still might need some adjustments. I think that can be quite tricky too.
Thank you for that. Declan, Mark, do you have any thoughts?
I do, but
Brilliant,
if Mark
Declan.
wants to, Mark, do you want to go first? No? Okay. I think that the issue around stereotyping of these two categories of conditions, if I can put it that way, is the real key here. I think that, you know, autism and Asperger's, both continuum conditions, and the importance of emphasizing that is that very often, like any organization or any employer, for example, people will be thinking in terms of boxes rather than continuums. The thing about a continuum is that you need to be able to understand the individual you're dealing with. This leads me to a general point that I want to make, even unbidden, about reasonable adjustments, which is, I think, the essence of reasonable adjustments is good communication both ways, if you can do it, and clarity of what the individual needs and understanding of what the individual needs. Now, autism and Asperger's really illustrate this really well, because you may have somebody who is at one point on this supposed continuum and will have very specific needs at that point. Somebody at a completely different point on the continuum will have needs that look very little like the first person's. So when asked the question, how is it viewed, looked on by the legal profession, the probable answer is probably stereotypically. But one point that this draws out is the need for the profession to understand general points about autism and Asperger's. Now, in particular, that's an area where something like the Equal Treatment Bench book can be quite a valuable resource for lawyers, not just the judges, but the lawyers appearing in front of them in chambers in general, because it gives some helpful, on the whole helpful, I think, guidance about what any particular, if you like, label may entail. And that starts the thought process going. Sorry, that was a long answer, and trying to plug some of my favorite thought answer, and I'll stop.
No, I'm very grateful. That was extremely helpful. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
Just very briefly, Doughty Street is a partner with Neurodiversity in Law, and I think they are perhaps the most effective organization that I've seen in terms of working in a particular area of disability within the legal system and getting visibility and awareness up. So their logo is on our website, and they've done great work, and anyone interested in neurodiversity should certainly speak to them.
I think all I'll add is this. Insofar as the question is, how is autism and Asperger's looked upon by the legal profession? I think the answer is, I think it's evolved quite markedly over the last 10, 15 years. I think when I was a baby barrister, people were very worried about admitting to autism or Asperger's, because the concern is, as Declan was saying, you'd be put in a box rather than being an understanding that there's a continuum. I've, over the last 15 or so years, I think there has been a great shift in attitudes, to a very great extent, I think, because of people such as those involved in neurodiversity in law. I think a greater awareness of these sorts of issues. I think also, frankly, as practitioners are discovering they've got children and relatives who are being diagnosed with these conditions, they're then suddenly gaining a greater understanding of it. I think that what I found, I think I mentioned earlier that I had a colleague who was, I have recently been asked to speak with someone who had autism and someone else who has had Asperger's, and the terror they had about coming forward. What I found very gratifying is once they have come forward and had the dialogue and explained the fact that it's a continuum and the fact that, and explained the support needs that they might have, their chambers, I've been very proud of the profession in that my experience so far has been most chambers want to be helpful. And if there have been missteps, it's inadvertent rather than anything else. I will treat that question as done. So, and I'm conscious we only have 6 minutes. Could the Bar Council work with the Inns of Court to ensure buildings accessibility, please? A student member of an inn our society wants to hold a Christmas social event but couldn't book a room in the inn because one of our committee members is a wheelchair user and all the rooms have steps access only. I will go first if I may. I suppose there are 2 points I'd make. I think there has historically been a degree to which Bar Council and the inns have worked in their separate silos, and there hasn't been a lot of dialogue between one and the other. I think dialogue, yes, but I wouldn't say a lot of it. I think that is getting better. And I think the inns are increasingly having discussions with the EDSM committee. I think there's also, as each of the inns are increasingly setting up their own equality and diversity and social mobility committees, there's an overlap of membership. I mean, until the end of this year, we'll have sat on Inner Temple's Equality, Diversity, Inclusivity Committee for 3 years while simultaneously sitting on Bar Council committees. I think so. I think there's an increasing awareness at the inns of diversity issues in a way I don't think there was 10 years ago, even as long ago as 10 years ago. I think one of the problems though with the inns, because I've had a number of discussions with my inn, I'm a bencher of Inner, about access issues, is the fact that a large part of their estate is listed, and actually being able to make the necessary adjustments to be able to fully accommodate practitioners, students, pupils with disabilities is very, very difficult. What I have found, certainly with Inner, is again, and this isn't in any way an advert for Inner, but it's just as a bencher of Inner, this is my experience. At Inner, if we're not able to accommodate, but you have a dialogue with Treasury Office, they will jump through hoops to find a way of trying to make it happen. It may not be precisely what you want, but within the parameters of dealing with very old buildings, they will try and find a way. I wondered if anyone else wanted to say anything on in respect of that question.
Mark.
I'm a member of Grays. I don't think we actually have a EDI committee. I do think that the inns should be doing more and should be working closer with the Bar Council and the Disability Panel on these issues, partly because we need the grassroots communication, as I said earlier. In terms of the listed buildings excuse, I'm very familiar with that because Doughty Street is obviously in listed buildings. And what I would say about it is, firstly, that it highlights the anticipatory duty because the inns, like chambers, have to think in advance about how they can accommodate a wheelchair user for education and social events. If it's going to take a couple of years to find a solution that is compliant with their listed building requirements. And secondly, sometimes you have to balance the legal duty to make reasonable adjustments against the listed buildings obligations and take a sort of realistic or even courageous approach rather than use any arguable risk of a listed building objection as an excuse not to do something and to kick it into the long grass.
Yeah, yes, Declan.
Just very briefly, because I see the time. This has been a bugbear for years and years and years, ever since I've been on the EDSN committee and indeed the previous disability committee. Ultimately, we may be at quite a good point in history for this argument about adjusting the inns buildings. And I think ultimately it may come down to a commercial question. As service providers, barristers, chambers have to make sure that they anticipate the needs of disabled service users. Their buildings need to be accessible. There will, over time, be a question for many chambers whether they stay within the inns or whether they go to other premises. And I think that if nothing happens about these sorts of questions, this will be an additional pressure that chambers will feel. And equally, it ought to be an additional pressure on the inns. That's my little rallying cry for a campaign of moving out of the inns.
I've been told that one thing we categorically cannot do is overrun. And given we have a 6:30 finish, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close there. Could I, first of all, thank Fleur, Mark and Declan for giving up their time this evening. I'm very, very grateful to you all. And I'm sure that there'd be a round of applause if we were in person, but we'll just have to put up with thanks from me, given the format. Attendees will be sent slides and links to resources, including links to the Bar Council helpline after the event. We will also be sending out a link to a feedback survey. I know it's a bit of a wrench to fill in the feedback survey. I would like Bar Council to be able to run many more of these events. I think these sorts of events are useful. If actually, having run it, we get one person saying it was all right, it makes my life a little more difficult making a pitch for the resources to do this sort of thing. So if I could ask you please to set aside the time to let us have your honest thoughts about this and your feedback, including ideas as to what else you'd like us to run on this theme going forward, I would be very, very grateful indeed. But again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to my fellow panelists and wish you all a pleasant evening.